Hello. So we finished the planning for our project, and we are about to start iteration number 2. So to start iteration number 2, we go back to our app development process. So this is iteration 2, and the title of this iteration is to display units in one view, in one picker view. So we say this is number 1, problem formulation. In the problem formulation, we define the scope of our iteration. So what exactly are we going to accomplish in this iteration? So we say in this iteration, we want upon loading the app, the list of units available, the list of available units is displayed in a picker view, like this wheel or the list of the wheels. So that's the scope of the app. I want to introduce you to something new that we haven't dealt with before with respect to this problem formulation, and that is testing. Once you define the scope of the app, immediately ask yourself, how would I know if my solution accomplished this scope? So you started now, we haven't done any solution formulation or any solution implementation yet. But when we finish this, we will have a solution, and the solution will be working. How can we close the loop and say, this solution that we created meets the scope, accomplishes the scope? Or we can come back to the scope and put a checklist, check sign, and say, done, the scope has been accomplished. That is what testing is about. So in the testing part of the problem formulation, and hopefully starting from now we keep adding this with us, is what test will determine that the solution meet the scope. Sometimes, depending on the scope, there would be more than one test. We call each one of those is a test case or test scenario. I like scenario more, but there's also test case. Every test case tests one aspect of the scope. In our scope here, we have only one part, which is you load the app will display the list of units. So we have only one test scenario. So what would be the testing scenario here? This testing scenario will be, for this scope, user loads the app, a list of these units, because we're going to be using some units, of the units is displayed in a picker view. What are the units that will be displayed that we want to see? The same units that are in the scope, which I did not write, which will be the same units that we wrote before. And this will be the feet, inch, mile, meter, kilometer. So then this means that once the app loads, in order for us to know that everything, we need to load it, and we'll see all of those in a view. So it will be something like this. The user will see feet, inch, mile, meter, and kilometer, and the picker view has this selector thing, and the user can scroll top and down. But that's what we want to see in the app to tell us that the scope has been accomplished. So in the problem formulation, we determine the scope and we determine the testing that will measure the scope. Then we move to the next step, which is solution formulation. And I know you're eager to start building. We have been talking for some time without building anything, and we're getting there. Sometimes you have to be patient until we get to until we have formulate a good understanding of what we wanted to accomplish. And we have a model and a view and a controller. So in the model, we learned before that we, in this case, we're only using units. So we're using the list of units. That's all in this scope. And the list of units will be modeled as as an array, as an NS array. So NS array. And we will put the list of units in a file, and we'll use the property list file because we used it before. In the second part is the view, and in the view we will have one screen with one picker view. So one picker view here inside the screen, and the picker view will have all the list. So what is the picker view? The picker view is a list of item, and we will need to, at this time, to learn more about the picker view. So we'll learn that the picker view is a library called UI picker view, and this library is responsible for displaying a list and give the user the ability to select from the list, and user scroll over the list. Where is the list coming from? And when the user scrolls, that's an action. Who responds to this action? The picker view requires multiple things. Number one, how many categories or columns, because you can have a picker view with one column, or you can have more. Like think of the date, where you have a month, day, and a year, or the clock, where you have an hour, minute, and a second. So this is a column. So you have categories, and then you have the rows. How many rows in there? And you have what goes on each row, which is the content, the title for each row. Because a picker view is a standard, is the same. You have a wheel and the user scrolls. That action is a standard regardless of how many categories, rows, or contents. The picker view is divided into 3 different libraries. So there is a UI picker view, and then there is a UI picker view data source, and a UI picker view delegate. The data source is responsible for providing the picker view with the list, and the delegate is responsible for responding to actions on the picker view. This is what we call class library, and these we call protocols. A protocol is a class library like the one we have done before, except that you have to provide the instructions. The library or a class library has default instructions in it. The protocol doesn't have any default instruction, what we call implementation. So actions in the protocol does not have any default instructions or any implementations, whereas in the class library it does. So in order to implement the picker view, we need to have an object to act. We need to have an object in our app that acts as the data source and the delegate. They could be the same object or could be more. So it's up to you. So you can have one object as a data source and one object as a delegate, or you can have one object doing both of them. You can use an existing object in your app already. So if your app already has an object, which is a library class or a custom class that you created, then you can use it. If not, you can make your own. Our app comes in with one already. Remember, we have the model, we have the view, so we have a third one. If you remember, yes, that's right, the controller. If you recall in previous projects, the controller was a class that we create and we connect it to the view. Especially in the second view, we saw how we had to create our own class and make the connection between that class and the view. So the controller is already a class. So the controller is an object that we have, and we used to reference that specifically in the extra credit last time. We're using the keyword self that refers to the controller object. So we can use the controller object to be the data source and the delegate for the pickerView, which means we have to implement in the controller more life cycle methods to perform and provide what the pickerView needs. So in this case, what the controller needs to do and when. And then when. So the controller needs to load the list of units from the file. And when should the controller do this? When the view loads. And this is an event we are familiar with, view did load. Then what the controller needs to do next, since it's going to act as a data source and a delegate for the pickerView, it needs to provide how many columns or categories in the pickerView. It needs to provide how many rows, and the number of rows in the pickerView will be the same as the number of units. We're going to need a row for every unit. And it needs to provide what is the title for each row, which will be the actual unit. And each one of those has a separate life cycle method that is part of the data source and part of the delegate. So this is called number of components in a pickerView. Component, not category. And this is called number of rows, and this is called title for row. When we open Xcode, we'll see in the documentation how we can find all of those. And then once the pickerView, the controller provides this, the pickerView will display everything. So then step number 3, the solution implementation. We'll start with number 1 is to set up the project. And we're going to call the project with your last name underscore unit converter. And we're going to start with the single view template. Then after setting up the project, we need to create a resource file with the units. Then we need to implement view did load. Actually, before, we can do that first. To load the units in an array. Then we need to add a pickerView to the view. And then we need to connect the pickerView to the controller as data source and delegate, which means I need to make the controller able to act as data source and delegate, and then make the connection, and then implement the 3 pickerView methods or functions. By the three, I mean those three: the number of components, the number of row, and the title for row. So implement all these, and then we should be able to see the picker view. So because of time, I want to keep the videos short. I'll stop here, and in the next video, we'll start directly with Xcode.